Today in the Global African, we'll have an in-depth conversation on Freddie Gray, the city of Baltimore, and a second field report from another week of the protests. That's Today in the Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher. Thanks for joining us again.
On April 19th, Baltimore resident Freddie Gray died 7 days after being subject to police violence in what would later be ruled a homicide by a medical examiner. Gray's death sparked community outrage in Baltimore as folks voiced their anger.
If we don't get no justice, then we don't get no peace. If we don't get no justice, then you don't get no peace.
If they killing us and they getting paid vacation, who's to say they won't get more paid vacation for killing another black man?
I had the opportunity to meet with Mr. Gray's family to discuss some of the details of the case and the procedural steps going forward. I assured his family that no one is above the law and that I would pursue justice on their behalf.
On May 1st, State Attorney Marilyn Mosby charged 6 Baltimore city officers with a series of crimes including manslaughter, misconduct, and murder.
To the people of Baltimore and the demonstrators across America, I heard your call for no justice, no peace. Your peace is sincerely needed as I work to deliver justice on behalf of this young man.
Immediately after news broke out, demonstrations took place all over the city.
We got justice, we got peace. We got justice, we got peace.
The Global African is here in Baltimore, Maryland on May the 2nd, a day after Marilyn Mosby announced 6 charges against police officers for the killing of Freddie Gray.
I was surprised at the extent of the charges. And the problem is that I was surprised. We are so used to our young people dying while in the hands of police and no charges being filed. It really, to see this happening is absolutely phenomenal.
We talked to some protesters to get their thoughts on news of the indictments.
I was right there on the steps when she made the announcement. I want to be one of the first citizens and one of the loudest citizens when I say we commend State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby for bringing charges to 6 murderers.
Well, I think she made the right decision, and I think she did it in a timely manner. If it was somebody regular on the streets, they would have been charged them for murder or vandalism or whatever it is. I think she did the right thing.
I thought they were very fair. I think a lot of people had their expectations extremely low, and I think that a lot of people didn't think that we were going to get what we got, and I think that they were very fair, at the least, to start the charging process.
These charges came 4 days after protests and uprisings took place in West Baltimore, drawing intense media attention. Some have even suggested that the uprisings were effective in bringing pressure to bear.
The only reason they brought charges against these killer cops was because that people came out in the streets and refused to accept it, not just here in Baltimore, but around the whole country.
Whether or not you see it, without Monday night, there would be no charges brought yesterday morning. And I keep saying that the world needed to see how angry and what black youth will actually do, how far we'll actually go to get justice. And I think the mayor inside knew, and I think the governor knew that was just the beginning.
Bobby Johnson, uncle to Oakland police brutality victim Oscar Grant, spoke about the systemic issues underlying public anger.
Well, we know, being that we've been involved in this fight for the past 6 years, we've seen other officers charged. But it's one thing to charge an officer, it's another to convict. Oscar Grant case, the officer was charged, arrested, convicted, and sent to jail. The minimum he was supposed to do was 12, but the judge reduced his time down to 11 months. He'd only spent 11 months in jail. And so what we have is a system that protects at all costs police officers when they commit the harms and the murders in our community.
We've been quiet for too long.
That's what he was saying.
We've been quiet for too long, and every time we're quiet and our voices are silenced, nothing gets done. Take down those businesses that gentrify the neighborhoods, because they raise the taxes in our communities. They're the ones that are putting our grandparents out. They're the ones that are taking the originators out and bringing the white flight recipients back into the city. And we need to fight that as well, because they're not doing anything for our communities. How we have $300,000 homes sitting next to $45,000 homes?
People put up with Ferguson, and the people are not going to put up with another sham. But also keep in mind that the district attorney out there was an old white man, Bob McCulloch. The district attorney here was a young black female. All of media is owned by filthy, rich white men. They control the message that all of America sees. They wanted the message to be that blacks are dangerous, that they loot, they burn, and they steal.
While there is an air of optimism here in Baltimore with the charges levied against the 6 officers, folks are still very, very hungry for systemic change that goes beyond indictment. Will city officials deliver? Police Department. For the Global African, with my cameraman Oscar Leon, I'm David Tiggert.
We're now joined for a discussion about the Baltimore uprising and crisis with Eddie Conway. Eddie Conway is an executive producer of the Real News Network. He is a former Minister of Defense of the Baltimore chapter of the Black Panther Party, who was locked up for 44 years for a false conviction of allegedly killing an officer. He's the author of the book Martial Law, The Life and Times of a Baltimore Black Panther. Welcome to the program.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. There has been discussion that the uprising was actually provoked by the police. And I was wondering if you could comment about that in terms of rumors being circulated about an alleged plan to kill police by gangs and things along those lines.
I was in the church for the funeral, and around 12 or a little after, the social media started circulating rumors that there would be purge, which is something based on a movie where the law don't exist for X amount of time, by high school students in Mondawmin Mall. At the end of the funeral, around 1 o'clock, we got reports that the mall had been shut down. Then we got reports around 2 o'clock that the public transportation system had been shut down. That's the metro system that sits adjacent to Mondawmin, in which everybody in that area uses to travel throughout the city. That had been shut down. And then around 3 o'clock, we got reports that a huge number of police had been put in place up in that area around Mondawmin and around the mall. And then around 3:30 or somewhere close, they let the students out of Douglas High School, and there was several hundred students that were out there. And then they weren't allowed to go and use the transportation system, which they had been doing all year, to go home, because Douglas is a citywide school, so people from East Baltimore might be in there, people from North Baltimore, West Baltimore, South Baltimore, et cetera, but they had no way of going home. And then that huge phalanx of police marched on the children and forced them down a half a mile away, down to Pennsylvania and North, which is unknown territory to most of the students there, because you don't go down in that area. That's a different hood altogether. And they forced those students down there with actual physical force, marching across the line. And then when they got to Pennsylvania North, they backed off and they left them there. And they left them there in that area with no way of getting home, in a hostile environment, and they acted out. And of course, they were acting out the whole time they were being forced down there. But once they got down there, then they were just in the center of the heart of a black community, and they responded, and people in the community joined them to respond. That was the initial incident. That incident was put on social media, and it went out to other areas, and that sparked other reactions throughout the community. But initially, those children were used to create that, and they were allowed in that area then to attack the CVS, because that's exactly what's on that corner. But they didn't attack the library. They didn't attack other things on that corner. They didn't attack the social service buildings on that corner, only the CVS, And so it's questionable exactly what happened there. No firemen responded. The police, obviously, the hundreds of police in riot gear was there in that area because that's why the children were contained there. It's almost as if they let them attack that area so they could have a national or international publicity around what was going on to distract the attention away from the fact that Freddie Gray was dead, had been buried, and there had been no resolution. The dialogue changed from what was wrong, what situation was created with him that caused him to die, to how young children from high school all of a sudden became thugs.
Right.
Now they're no longer the high school. If this had been in a white community, if this had been in an upscale community, buses would have been there. Since everybody knew this was going on from 12 o'clock, buses would have been there, children would have been put on buses, they would have been bussed out of the area and allowed to go home or proceed. They certainly would have been protected and shepherded instead of corralled and forced into another hostile area.
So who would be responsible for this?
There's probably going to be a number, and it really needs to be investigated. Yeah. Somebody decided to close the mall. Okay.
Right.
So that's probably the ownership of the mall. Somebody decided to close the subway, the transportation system, knowing that those children needed it to get out of the area. That's probably somebody in City Hall. Somebody decided to put a large number of police and riot gear in place there. That could be the police commissioner or somebody also in City Hall. Somebody decided to push those children to Pennsylvania and north. That's 6 blocks away. I don't know who, but that needs to be looked into because it might have been negligent, it might have been mismanagement, or it might have been deliberate. But it changed the narrative that was going on. You had in the city at the time people from all over the world. You had in the city at the time people from the highest levels of government in the city, the state, and the national government was here for that funeral. So, and in a space of 2 hours, the narrative changed to thugs.
Now, during the disturbances in Baltimore, there were groups like the Nation of Islam and various clergy and gangs that came together that were trying to talk with some of the young rebels, as I call them. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a whole lot of press attention on that, though. What was your sense of those kind of activities?
Yeah, I think that it was a lot of that, but because to me, this was not the general desire of the population. This was a reaction and a response to the earlier situation with the young people. It kind of like it just exploded there and spread for a little while, but then the city wasn't in rebellion. Yeah. I mean, this was like an outbreak, an outcry.
Interesting.
And so, I mean, to come out and talk to people, which is everybody did, wasn't really a hard job because people weren't there anyway. They really weren't trying to do that, but it was, and I think Dr. King said it's like rides is the voice of the unheard.
That's right.
You know, and young people didn't feel like they were being heard, and one of the reasons that is that Freddie Gray is the 111th death at the hands of the police in the last 3 years in the state of Maryland. And nobody has been indicted or charged no indictment, no charge, certainly no convictions. And young people are seeing this over and over again, nationally and here. But for young people, it wasn't even just the deaths, but it's the constant harassment, the constant being stopped, the constant being forced off of their own front steps, no loitering on your own front steps in some community, or feeling under observation when you pass through an upscale neighborhood that's not yours. So it was a litany of things that they had beyond the deaths.
Where was the mayor during all of this?
We don't know. I don't know. I mean, there was, and that was part of the problem. If there had been some statements in the beginning about what was going to happen.
From the very beginning.
Yeah. There could have probably been a different outcome. If there had been supervision the whole time, it's certainly the time of the incident at Mondawmin, that should have been supervised. Those young children, 14 years old to 17 years old, they are children. They're in school. You got them in school. You got them locked in school. Take them home.
Right.
It's that simple. Why wasn't that supervised? It kind of reminded me of Katrina in New Orleans. People in New Orleans trying to leave New Orleans.
That's right.
And they were accosted on their highways to leave by armed vigilantes and forced back into New Orleans and suffered for about a week.
That's right.
And people died as a result of that. This thing that happened up at Mondawmin is similar. These students wanted to go home, and they were accosted by an armed group of vigilantes and forced to go somewhere they didn't want to go, and consequently got in trouble for it.
Eddie Conway, thank you very, very much.
Okay, thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us for this segment of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher. Stay tuned and we'll be right back. We're here with activist and actor Danny Glover, talking with us about Baltimore and the crisis here and national and perhaps even global implications. Danny, welcome to the program.
Thanks a lot, Bill. Yeah.
So, what did you feel when you heard the announcement by Mosby, State Attorney Mosby, about the charges?
So I think what's still critical in the sense, despite all of that, we had to continue to mobilize and continue to build. And really, ultimately, what we have to build is the movement that's necessary. And certainly, in various ways, we see aspects of that, not necessarily, I think, in part, the rebellion, yes, because there's different forces that come together, different alliances that happen. I was listening to Democracy Now!, and they had groups that were cleaning up the CVS that had been burnt and everything else and those things. So there's different relationships there. Certainly that the parents have now realized that it is important for them to now act as the role of citizens, not in respect to their own young as well. I mean, it's not a new realization but there has to be, in some sense, a building a bridge around movement. You know, we see, for instance, we just had the march that came through here. The youth march that came through here, where youth march from New York to Washington, D.C., present legislators with initiatives, with different other things in terms of policy, of different things they wanted enacted and things to work on, whether it was racial profiling, as the case, or in this case, whether it was providing resources for youth as well, and opportunities for youth. So I think, on the one hand, in that sense, there is a presentation of demands, a presentation there. But it still doesn't deal with the major problems that have happened in a city like Baltimore. I was here last Mother's Day in Baltimore in a rally which was sponsored by SEIU in support of workers at Johns Hopkins who were receiving just abysmal pay and benefits here. So you see, historically, Johns Hopkins, one of the leading hospitals in the world, research hospitals in the world, paying these abysmal salaries to workers, whether they're knowledgeable about that because they often contract out to the services, the employment services that happen to some other entity. And so they often remove themselves from full responsibility of what happens to the workers there. Whether that's the case, and I'm not so sure. But the fact that we have that here and in Baltimore at this particular place, and it symbolizes a pattern that's going on with the whole deindustrialization of inner cities and cities, the loss of jobs, the loss of employment, I mean, living wage employment. You know, those are the things that you're going to have to deal with. Those things, and turning the corner on there is the next thing that we have to talk about.
The, you know, one of the issues that emerged after the uprising, as another guest raised, was a shift in the narrative. That after, you know, in the beginning it was, the attention was on what happened to Freddie Gray and Justice Freddie Gray. Then the uprising takes place, and all of a sudden there's references to the young people being thugs and criminals, etc. And while there was certainly a criminal element that was there, that was not what was driving this uprising. What do you say about that? How do you respond to that?
Well, the first thing is that there's always an attempt to criminalize even the uprising itself, to seek out all the kind of things that all the agendas that power wants to embellish the whole idea that they were thugs and everything else. And that was like simply not there were elements within this, as expected, there were elements in this who had another agenda as well within that, you know, and to use the opportunity somewhere else. I certainly, on the one hand, the rebellion happened. The rebellion is a reaction and responsibility to what is happening, and responsible to what is happening over decades in this city. The rebellion is a combination of historic pain, historic neglect, and that's what the rebellion is responsible. It has been, as it was a generation ago or 2 generations ago, the rebellion is a response of that. So the question becomes is that if we look at the rebellion, it simply has to look at the rebellion and turn it inward to look what's happening that made the rebellion, allowed the rebellion to be responsible. Yeah, the police killing was one aspect of it. That was one aspect of it, but there's so many other layers on it. So when we cannot debate and talk about a narrative that addresses the layers that are under this, the historic layers that are under this, then we're not getting anywhere in building the movement that we're talking about. So yes, that's certainly an easy out for that, you know, but we have to believe that we are the ones at this particular moment, we can create and reimagine or redirect the narrative or create our own narrative in a sense. Right here at The Real News is a group of young debaters that their basically objective is to promote debate over public policy. That's what they do here. Young people who play public policy. They stopped the building of a youth jail, a new youth jail, just a couple of years ago. So the narrative it's certainly a narrative that shifts in the same way that we use terrorism as a narrative. You know, we use the same thing as this rebellion as a narrative to even diminish those people who are the ones who are most affected, and the ones who are most affected by policies unseen when you drive here from the suburbs through Baltimore going to your job. You don't pay attention to what's happening and the undercurrent of what's happening in that area you drive through. In fact, you may in some sense be pissed off because you have to pay taxes to fix the roads that you have to drive to get to your job. You know, in a sense, so in essence, we don't see this, and that's the tragedy of this country. We have, because all the except for The Real News and a few others, all the news agencies provide us, the corporate news agencies provide us with the narrative that instills fear, a lack of understanding, a lack of compassion, a lack of any directing where the real issue is and who are the real perpetrators of what's happening.
Danny Glover, thank you very much as always.
All right.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and we'll see you next time.